Most of the things I review here are Japanese cartoons colloquially referred to as anime that air on Japanese television and are produced by Japanese animation studios, such as Madhouse, A1 Pictures, Bones, Ufotable Dean, you get the idea. This is an exception to that rule, in more ways than one, produced by an internet production company based in Austin, Texas, called Rooster Teeth. My fanbase would probably be much more familiar with Rooster Teeth as the creators of RWBY, an anime-styled web series that is a mixed bag if ever there was one. They also run a fairly prolific Let's Play channel, Achievement Hunter, and have produced a myriad of other live-action and animated series, short form and otherwise, many of which in their own right I would give a full recommendation. But I am here today to tell you that when it comes to Rooster Teeth, you should not be watching RWBY, or any of the rest, at least on their own. No, you should be watching their first original series, the literal genesis of the entire company. Without it, we would not have the rest, Red versus Blue. Okay, stop. Before we get into the series itself, we need some backstory and some context. Red vs. Blue is a machinima series, which sounds like a made-up word because it kind of is. Machinima is a portmanteau of machine and cinema, thus meaning basically cinema that is produced via machine, specifically computer graphic engines, even more specifically, video games. Yes, it is a show shot in a video game, mostly. More on that later. Which could be hard to swallow on principle, but I assure you, back in the day, at say 6-7 years ago, machinima was actually a thing. People filmed and put a story to game footage. I've seen stuff in Quake, stuff in The Sims, stuff in Smash Bros, and of course, stuff in Halo. Halo is pretty much the go-to tool for machinima because of Red vs. Blue. Red vs. Blue was produced kind of on a whim as a fun thing between friends in early 2003. You heard right, 2003. Red vs. Blue predates YouTube. It's been around a long time. And it quickly gained popularity, giving rise to Rooster Teeth proper, which ballooned from that group of friends into what is now a 200-plus employee company. And Red vs. Blue has never stopped, with the 14th season having just wrapped up this October. So take a moment, sit back, suspend your disbelief, and let's talk about Red vs. Blue. As the characters themselves put it in the very first episode, Red vs. Blue is about two opposing armies, the Reds and the Blues, both camped out in a box canyon in the middle of nowhere. The only reason they have a red base over there is because they have a blue base over there. And the only reason they have a blue base over there is because they have a red base over there. It is a conflict without purpose, but a conflict nonetheless. That may sound familiar because it sounds exactly like the multiplayer of any given first-person shooter, which is, of course, exactly the point. Red vs. Blue begins as nothing more than a parody of that in which it is filmed, asking, why are we here? Why are these two arbitrarily defined groups fighting? Where are they supposed to find the motivation to fight when the conflict is so meaningless? It's not as if the soldiers themselves have any idea, and as such, very little fighting actually takes place, instead whittling away the days, talking and bickering amongst each other. From there, Red vs. Blue spirals into surprising and convoluted directions involving conspiracy, artificial intelligence, and superpowered mercenaries, but always centered on this group of idiots from a box canyon in the middle of nowhere. By necessity, Red vs. Blue had to be well written, at least in terms of its comedy. For its first 7 seasons, and most of the seasons thereafter, the vast majority of its runtime is just jokes and dialogue. People standing around and talking. That's all they do.
That's all they ever do, is just stand there and talk.
If the banter wasn't sharp, nor characters memorable, audience interest would fade fast. It didn't, because the characters are great and hilarious, and they are the linchpin of Red vs. Blue. I haven't done this kind of setup in a while, but let's go through them one by one, starting with the Red Team. Episode 1 of Red vs. Blue starts us off with a conversation between two Red Team soldiers, Griff and Simmons. These two are a beloved pair that bicker like an old married couple because their personalities clash so neatly. They're like peanut butter and jelly. Simmons is an awkward kiss-ass nerd fixated on the boring stuff like order and math and cleanliness, while Griff is a fat lazy slop, not that the fat part can really come through since everyone is visually identical save for armor color, but you pick up on these things. Under Griff and Simmons is the Red Team rookie, Donut, who as you may guess from his choice of armor is happy-go-lucky and fairly effeminate. Lopez is their Spanish-speaking manual labor robot, don't ask, and we round things out with the Red Leader, Sarge, a gruff southern drill sergeant type character who often gets caught up in ridiculous orders and plans of attack to one-up those dirty blues. Speaking of, we'll kick off the blue team introductions with Tucker, a snarky ladies man, or the kind of guy that tries to be, since all the soldiers in the canyon are dudes, including fellow blue soldier, Caboose, the fan favorite, an idiot who becomes increasingly divorced from reality as the series progresses, starting as a fairly normal, if inattentive and forgetful person, until eventually becoming Homestar Runner. God, I hope someone gets that. The blue team's smaller than the red, so the third and final member is their leader, Church, who, well, he's kinda just an asshole with a sniper rifle. Aside from the two teams, there are plenty of unaffiliated characters of varying importance. Doc, Tex, Sister, Agent Washington, and many more. But that'd be getting too detailed for the level of this review. And it's important to remember that, in addition to their personalities, most of these characters are also sarcastic and quippy. That is crucial. They're cynical assholes, and that's part of their charm. It's strangely gratifying to watch the cast evolve from a group of strangers who hate each other into a group of friends that still hate each other, but can have each other's back when the need arises. The show is certainly an ensemble, but if you had to pick, you could say the main character is Church, the blue team leader. Without getting into specifics, much of the plot revolves around him, and his actions are usually what drive forward progress in the story. That's not to say everyone else is pointless, but when it comes time for major things to happen, Church is usually the guy to make them happen. Interestingly, even discounting Church, the Blues see much more character growth and embellishment overall than the Reds, who remain fairly static from beginning to end. Every Blue, even Caboose, has at some point moments of emotion or development, but the only one on the Red team put through anything even approaching extenuating character circumstances would be Sarge, and it's more of a momentary lapse than a sticking development. This is not a bad thing, though, as keeping the cast consistent, as long as they're still entertaining, allows the series to root itself in where it all began, and not diverge too far from what made it so good in the first place, especially since the plot itself does ultimately stray quite far from those humble Box Canyon beginnings. Red vs. Blue's plot is organized into very clearly defined arcs, which you can see on screen right now. Each arc is characterized by both the game it is shot in, and the specific goals or themes of the narrative. Every arc finale, of which there are 4 as you can see, also doubles as a satisfactory series finale if one chose to stop there, with some, such as 10 and 13, being very, very good endings. But since the quality hasn't dropped off yet, I won't begrudge them for keeping the train going. The first arc, the Blood Gulch Chronicles, is definitely as a narrative the most disjointed, and also by far the most outright comedic. It starts off just lampooning aspects of Halo itself, like the silliness of trained soldiers fighting over a flag, or simply the fact that the Warthog never runs out of ammo. But by even the end of that first season, it starts growing into its own as an actual story, and that shift becomes most apparent once we hit the new arc in Season 6, which starts to more heavily incorporate elements of drama without ditching the comedy. You can tell that early on they were just making it up as they went along, so the writing really deserves credit in the later seasons once it becomes more of a legitimate film production that actually incorporates prior incidental details and offhand jokes that were very likely thrown in at random into the larger storyline that is now being told. It's actually praiseworthy to take small, innocuous details that were never intended as anything at all, and build them on top of each other into revelations and twists that actually make complete sense, even going so far as to answer little questions that seemed off. And plot aside, the jokes too tend to call back to prior seasons. There's a lot of running gags in Red vs. Blue. This one teleporter joke originated in Season 1 and pops up again in Season 8, while an alien sword thing introduced in 4 becomes extremely relevant to the plot of 13. Things do take another shift with Season 11, as the writing and directing roles of the series pass from a couple of the company founders, Bernie Burns and Matt Hullum, to Miles Luna. Miles is also a head writer on Ruby, so he's kind of a key cog in the Rooster Teeth machine at this point. A big change of that nature, especially after 10 years, is always cause for reasonable concern, but Miles kills it with his spin on Red vs. Blue. The funny thing is, at that point, Red vs. Blue had already been going on for so long that Miles was a fan before he was an employee, so he gets it. The first season under his wing kinda goes back to basics, aiming for the pure, standing around and talking feel of the very early seasons, but interjected with some subdued character moments and just generally stronger writing than its predecessor. And then the arc snowballs into an awesome time, inspired by the question, what would happen if these idiots found themselves in the middle of an actual war? But I suppose I've reached the point where I need to address how Red vs. Blue looks, since how a show looks is undeniably a draw or detriment for a fair number of people. As you are all well aware by now, this series is filmed in Halo. Halo 1, Halo 2, Halo 3, and all the rest. Well, all of them except for Halo 5. It may not sound appealing to watch video game avatars standing around bobbing their heads up and down, but trust me, you very quickly won't think anything of it, especially once the series moves into Halo 3. In Halo 1 and 2, the camera was a player. There was no other way to record game footage, so the possible angles and shots were very limited, and Rooster Teeth just had to accept it. But, if you were not aware, starting from Halo 3, the games were packaged with a feeder mode, which allowed the player to assume the form of a flying camera that could go anywhere, as well as a forge mode which allowed heavy map customization. Because of these two factors, Red vs. Blue becomes a lot more interesting to look at after the introduction of Halo 3, because they can be a lot more ingenious with in-game items and mechanics, as well as take shots that literally were not possible beforehand, such that things actually start to feel purposefully directed and composed. On the other hand, if we're talking purely graphically, since we're spanning over a decade of games, the visual spectrum is a wide one. Halo 1 is not pretty by today's standards, but it gets the job done. I'd say the best looking for these machinima purposes is Halo 3, which sounds a little counterintuitive since it was released before Reach and 4, but there's some good reasons for this. 3's color palette is by far the most vibrant of the series, and the armor design is simple and stylized, but easy to differentiate. Reach's colors are a bit more muted and thus less interesting to look at, while 4's armor feels too bulky and overcomplicated to be as visually appealing when it's what you're constantly having to look at. But not content to settle for just what the game allows, Rooster Teeth from a very early point, i.e. sometime in Season 1, added their own assets and effects into the show, like these gravestones and that wrench. Top of the line special effects work right there. Later, they get a bit more ambitious, with for example a scene in Season 10 involving a Halo 3 avatar on a Halo 2 map talking to a Halo 1 avatar, and that's kinda neat. One of the most fascinating things about this series coming into it now from a modern perspective is just watching it grow, seeing how it evolves from this...
Hey, yeah? You ever wonder why we're here?
...into this.
Hey. Yeah? You ever wonder why
Everybody out!
Hey, go!
Jumping out of this thing.
Let's move, people!
Yeah, let's move.
Oh, did I not mention the biggest thing? Starting from Season 8, Rooster Teeth starts to incorporate, and sometimes heavily incorporate, its own CGI into Red vs. Blue, animated, at least initially, by the late Monty Ohm. Words cannot describe how this change felt at the time, because the first scene that ever used CGI was a car bursting through a wall. Completely unexpected and completely unannounced. And it was amazing. I kid you not, I showed that to everyone I knew. But the CGI is a slight double-edged sword. Naturally, it allows for unique movements and awesome action scenes utterly impossible in the standard game engine, but at the same time, I can't help but feel they got lazier with what they could do in-game after they started producing their own animation. In Season 6, when they first got their hands on Forge, they went off the wall and creative with the in-game possibilities, but that kind of fell by the wayside later on, which I can understand. It's probably a real hassle to toy around with all that in-game stuff, but part of me missed it. And interestingly, if unsurprisingly, after Monty's untimely demise, the style of the animated choreography undergoes a radical shift. Monty's style was very acrobatic and over the top, but the new style is quite a bit more reserved and grounded. It's not necessarily worse than Monty's style, just different, and which one you personally prefer will come down to individual preference. I prefer Monty. I have a friend who prefers post-Monty. However, a common point of the CGI in all its incarnations is making really cool use of environmental set pieces, whether it's an avalanche, a crowded highway, a speeding train, or a lack of gravity. But it's not all sunshine and rainbows with the production values. Remember, when Red vs. Blue first began, and for a few years after that, it was basically just a couple friends cracking jokes in their bedroom who didn't entirely know what they were doing, and in the mid-2000s. So, to put it bluntly, the audio quality of the first few seasons is bad.
Okay, I'm getting really sick of asking people what's going on through that sniper rifle.
Not only the mic quality, but the audio mixing too is pretty awful, with varying voice volumes and some very loud sound effects. This improves dramatically over time, but even Season 5 sounds a little tinny by modern standards, though this is partially intentional to mimic the sound of a voice being delivered through the external speakers of a powered exoskeleton. And visually, the first 4 seasons originally were not HD or even full screen. They were captures of a player looking at other players and just cropping out the gun and health bars and editing. So what you're left with is a slit with the gun's reticle squarely in the center. But don't you worry, these days they've re-recorded all the footage shot for shot of all those seasons from the ground up in an HD 16:9 aspect ratio and free of any HUD interference, which I really respect considering how much of a task that had to be. And as a side note on problems with the games themselves, this is not at all Rooster Teeth's fault, nor something they could have fixed or done anything about, but the way Halo 4 is programmed, it forces avatars to raise their guns whenever players move or crouch, which looks very awkward, and I really have to question why it happened. Please someone tell me Halo 5 fixed that. Red vs. Blue is very fun, but being primarily a comedy, its plot is far from perfect, especially in the first 5 seasons. In those seasons, the story is very meandering and convoluted, partially because it was being made up on the fly, and otherwise because just standing around and talking, no matter how funny it is, doesn't exactly lend itself to a naturally flowing narrative. After that first arc, as I've said, the writing becomes much stronger, but the story does go through some slight repetitions. For example, with one character in particular being unintroduced then reintroduced 4 times over the span of 6 seasons. And remember when I said each arc ending could double as a series ending, but that they kept going and it's still great? Well, 2 keep going with season 11. They retcon some very heavily implied things about 10's ending, which I would mind a lot more if the story that they produced as a result of those retcons sucked. But it didn't, so I don't. In fact, of all 14 seasons of Red vs. Blue, I'd say there's only a season and a half I have major grievances with, and I shall explain both of them now. Firstly, and by far the larger of the 2 offenders, Season 9. With Season 9, they were hot off the introduction of CGI into the series, so they went all in, and it was the closest Red vs. Blue ever got to losing itself. While on one hand, the general increase in production value meant that 9 marked the first time when Red vs. Blue could be said to have an actual musical score, as opposed to what before had essentially been a small handful of themes, the story became far too serious, characters took off their helmets, which looked pretty awful, and the sparse machinima scenes that did exist felt relatively unfunny and were almost entirely pointless. Thankfully, this was followed up by the superb Season 10, which shared a focus on CGI, but CGI that looked much better and was paired with much more interesting and immediately relevant scenes that were still filmed in-game. In fact, I would say Season 10 is the visual high point for the quality of the series' CGI, presumably because they started diverting animation resources to Ruby shortly thereafter, which premiered around the time Red vs. Blue 11 began. Likely for a similar reason, the fight choreography in Season 12 was very lacking. The other half season I have problems with is Season 14, the newest season and the anthology season. Basically, the ending of 13 was so good that they decided not to try and capitalize on it, instead going completely episodic and telling various side stories that fit in at various points in the timeline. However, while I appreciate the breadth of styles and writers that this season enjoyed, it often felt less like the anthology season and more like the guest season, an excuse to promote other content creators and just push anything vaguely related to Red vs. Blue. There were some very solid one-off episodes, but then others that really fell flat. Yes, it's filmed in a video game, but otherwise, Red vs. Blue is a hilarious and well-written series with tons of fun characters and even some badass action sequences. Thinking back on it, it's actually very impressive that Red vs. Blue is as entertaining as it is. Consider having to write the script in the 7 years before you can use CGI. Other than talking, your character's actions are extremely limited. You can walk, you can run, you can crouch, you can jump, and you can shoot a gun. That's all you can communicate non-verbally. You wouldn't think that a bunch of Halo avatars standing around in a circle bobbing their heads, could inspire much of anything in the viewer, but you would be wrong. Once you get to know these idiots, you won't want to let them go. So after taking everything into account, as well as my own subjective enjoyment on a scale from F to S, Red vs. Blue is a very easy A. Some specific seasons, such as 6 and 10, maybe rise to the level of an S, but overall I feel good with an A. It's a series I'll always look back on fondly, and be more than willing to keep watching for however long they keep making it. Although with 13's ending and how well it wrapped up, I'm not sure I even want any more. You should know that while basic familiarity with Halo lore could be helpful, it is by no means a necessity to enjoy this series. Red vs. Blue is very much its own, self-contained thing, and a thing that is currently available on Rooster Teeth's website, roosterteeth.com, YouTube from the official Red vs. Blue channel, and Netflix. Yes, Netflix. But if you do go and watch it, make sure to look up and check out the Between Seasons mini-series, because some of those are vital. Also watch the Season 6 and 7 trailers at their appropriate points, as they are in effect prologues. Each season is more or less the length of a movie, so you're looking at about 14 movies. Go nuts. And that'll do it. Thanks for watching, have a great day, leave any feedback in the comments, subscribe if you want more. And if there's anything you'd like to see reviewed, by all means, tell me. See you next time.
Riding on our shiny metal horses, singing our rider song. One of us will be forgotten.